Hello everyone, today I want to talk to you about how Indian media have changed their stance and admitted that China's control over rare earths is so deep that there's no way to compete with it. Also, the truth behind India's earlier disastrous air battle with Pakistan has been revealed. China's J-10CE fighter jet played a key role thanks to its gallium nitride active phased array radar. As the political rivalry between China and the US intensifies this spring and summer, even the Indian media, which has always been hostile towards China, have started to admit that there is a fundamental gap between India and China. On May 26, the Times of India, the country's largest English-language newspaper, unusually published an article with a completely different tone, admitting that their previous underestimation of China was a hasty mistake. They changed their tune, saying that China's rare earth strategy is actually more resilient than it appears on the surface. Just a month ago, this newspaper was still confidently claiming that China's restrictions on rare earth exports were like shooting themselves in the foot, but unexpectedly, they've already shifted their stance so quickly. This matter actually started a few months ago, when the US government officially imposed so-called reciprocal tariffs on most countries, including China and India. However, China and India chose completely different strategies in response. China didn't hesitate to fight back. Not only did they impose counter-tariffs on the US, but they also used key resources as leverage, announcing further export controls on certain rare earth products, directly targeting the weak spots of America's new energy and military industries. In contrast, India stuck to its usual tactic of stalling and delaying with the US. In April, during US Vice President Harris's visit to India, the Indian government suddenly announced a 12% provisional tariff on certain imported steel products, effective for 200 days, claiming that this move was to curb the influx of cheap steel mainly from China. But in reality, the aim was to cooperate with the US in containing China, hoping to get the US to show a bit of goodwill on the tariff issue in return. However, the US response was ice cold. They neither promised to sign a trade agreement with India, nor did they have any intention of helping India move up in the global supply chain. Instead, they still want to bring production directly back to the US. At the time, the Times of India, following the Indian government's strategy, mocked and ridiculed China's countermeasures. Their commentary claimed that China's tightening of rare earth exports would cause global buyers to look elsewhere, thereby weakening China's dominance in the rare earth market. The report even deliberately put India's rare earth potential on par with China, hinting that India might be able to get a share of the pie and possibly take over in the future. After the first month, China and the US reached a preliminary trade agreement, while India still had to continue negotiations with the US. A new article from the Times of India completely overturned its previous stance. The article stated that the earlier view that China was weakening its own share in the rare earth market was a reckless misreading of China's 30 years of strategic preparation. The article said that China does not rely solely on its rare earth resources, but has secured the lifeline of the global rare earth industry through systematic planning and technological dominance. The Times of India admitted that China not only controls a large amount of rare earth mineral reserves, but also possesses the world's most advanced rare earth refining capabilities, technology patents, and downstream industrial chains. These are the key gaps that India finds hard to overcome. What's even more ironic is that the Times of India had previously boasted with great confidence in its articles that India was catching up in the rare earth industry, but now it has to admit that India is still far from having even the basic development capabilities. Although the article still claims that India is working hard to catch up, it also mentions that the Modi government had already launched the National Critical Minerals Mission last year, aiming to promote the exploration, mining, and processing of rare earth resources. But anyone familiar with India's resource industry knows that this is nothing more than an empty policy statement. Up to now, India still heavily relies on imported equipment for rare earth refining, and there are only a handful of fully established rare earth separation plants in the country. Not only does it lack refining processes and technical personnel, but it also lacks industrial scale. What's even more critical is that the rare earth refining process involves a large number of chemical treatment facilities, which in India face numerous environmental approval hurdles and public opposition, making it unlikely for such projects to even get off the ground. According to foreign media analysis, the reason why Indian media suddenly changed their tune may not be because they've recognized the depth of China's industry, but rather because they've been confronted by reality. When the US-China trade war escalated, the United States tried to bypass China and look for other sources of rare earths, but repeatedly hit a wall. Both the Biden and Trump administrations invested heavily to set up rare earth production lines, but so far, they are still stuck at the experimental process stage. Mass production is out of the question, and they are nowhere near self-sufficiency. India believes that the US is constrained by China, which is why China can force the US to sign temporary agreements. It was only at this point that Indian media realized that, in the rare earth sector, there is only one country in the world that can choke the US, and that's China. Previously, they had misjudged China's ability to fight back. The conclusion is, China holds the trump card of rare earths. If China and the US completely fall out, the American military-industrial sector could come to a standstill. One example of this is related to the Chinese J-10CE fighter jet, which has been in the spotlight recently during the India-Pakistan air skirmishes. The active phased array radar on the J-10CE relies on gallium nitride, and as early as August 2023, China had already started controlling the export of gallium nitride. Speaking of the India-Pakistan air battle, there are still many aspects worth discussing. It comes back to the same question: how did the Pakistan Air Force manage to achieve a 6-0 result? How much of that was down to weaponry? How much of it was due to human error or misjudgment? Mainland social media writer Guan Yujie wrote an article analyzing the inside story of the India-Pakistan air battle, saying that although the Indian military's tactics looked perfect, they still ruined India's national prospects for the next 50 years. First, the Indian military's tactics. These conflicts were deliberately provoked by India to divert attention from its internal issues. Indian Prime Minister Modi had already made up his mind, planning to strike when Pakistan was unprepared, determined to take a bite out of what he saw as an easy target. This was the situation facing Indian Air Force Chief of Staff Prif. This is the situation Singh is facing. The message from India's top leadership was crystal clear: in this India-Pakistan conflict, they would only advance, not retreat, only win, not lose. Singh was well aware that the Indian Air Force's actual combat capability was worrying, but he still came up with a high-pressure battle plan. Since the Indian Air Force was built with huge investments, they decided to go all out with a massive offensive. At 12:10 a.m. on May 7th, a huge formation of 72 aircraft, including Rafales, Mirage 2000s, Su-30 MKIs, and MiG-29s, split into several groups and roared towards Pakistan. Such a scale is extremely rare in the history of aerial warfare since World War II. But actually, Singh wasn't just trying to show off, he simply wanted to achieve a huge victory at minimal cost through a battle that was expected to be very easy. According to the disclosed information, the 72 fighter jets that the Indian military sent up that night were not risking their lives by flying into Pakistani territory. They didn't even plan to cross the border, which is the line of actual control with Pakistan. What the Indian military wanted to do was to have Rafale and Su-30 MKI fighter jets fly at low altitude to avoid Pakistani ground radar, get close to the border, and then launch air-to-ground missiles at targets inside Pakistan. The other fighter jets would act as armed escorts, responsible for distracting the enemy's attention. So the main reason for deploying so many fighter jets at once is to use the advantage of launching a large number of missiles to break through Pakistan's air defense network. If dozens of missiles suddenly come in from multiple directions in one night, the Pakistani side would most likely not have enough time to react, and at least a few targets would definitely be hit. After the strike, they could boast about it as much as they want. More importantly, this plan perfectly matches the actual capabilities of the Indian Air Force. They know that they are luxuriously equipped but have limited capabilities and are not prepared to engage in close combat with the Pakistani Air Force. According to the plan, the Indian military isn't afraid of the Pakistani side sending out fighter jets to retaliate after being bombed. This is based on their assessment of missile range. The Indian Air Force's air-to-ground missiles intended for the airstrike are larger, slower, and structurally simpler than air-to-air missiles, so they have a longer range. The BrahMos air-to-ground missiles used by the Indian military in this attack can reach up to 300 kilometers, while the Mica air-to-air missiles mounted on their fighter jets for long-range aerial combat have a range of only 50 kilometers. In other words, in their view, the effective distance for aerial combat is roughly around 50 kilometers. Although the export version of the PL-15 air-to-air missile that China sold to the Pakistani military is clearly stated in the manual to have a range of 145 kilometers. The Indian military believes that most countries tend to exaggerate the specifications of their weapons, so the PL-15 probably can't actually reach that far. Considering that even the radar detection range of India's own top-tier Rafale fighter jets can't reach 145 kilometers, they naturally assume that the lower-end J-10CE would see even less. So, the Indian military thinks that as long as they don't fly within 100 kilometers of the border, they'll be quite safe. But this is probably their biggest misjudgment, thinking that a 300-kilometer air-to-ground missile range gives them the upper hand compared to the enemy's 100-kilometer air-to-air missile range. Now, let's talk about Pakistan's counterattack. At 12:10 a.m. tomorrow, Indian fighter jets will start taking off rapidly from multiple airbases, thinking they can do it without anyone noticing. But in fact, the Pakistani military has always been well aware of what the Indian forces are up to. So how did the Pakistani military manage to do this? Actually, there's nothing particularly mysterious about it. They simply and diligently set up a comprehensive frontline monitoring system. During the conflict, the Pakistani military always had early warning aircraft and a small number of fighter jets conducting round-the-clock air patrols every day. Together with ground-based air defense radars, including those paired with air defense missiles, they could basically achieve all-weather monitoring of India's central region. As soon as the first plane took off, they could detect it immediately. The main early warning aircraft used by the Pakistani side was the ZDK-03 Silk Road I early warning aircraft, which was an early model developed by China. It uses a relatively outdated mechanically rotating mushroom-shaped radar, and its performance is far inferior to the current Air Police 500 early warning aircraft in service in our country. But the Pakistani military wasn't panicking, because they had already achieved information sharing between their early warning aircraft, radars, ground-based radars, air defense missiles, and the radars used by their patrol fighter jets. So, the Pakistani military wasn't relying on any single radar device to monitor the Indian forces, but rather on a massive surveillance network. At 12:30 a.m., 72 Indian fighter jets assembled in the air. 7 minutes later, the Pakistani military, including the J-10Cs, had a total of 42 fighter jets assembled in the air as well. At 12:40 a.m., the Indian fighter jets reached their designated distance and, according to plan, launched the first round of strikes on targets inside Pakistan. But the Pakistani forces had not only identified the number and models of the Indian aircraft, they even figured out exactly which planes had just launched missiles, so the Pakistani command decisively gave the order to open fire. However, their targets were limited only to the Indian aircraft that had previously launched missiles. Since the Indian fighter jets did not cross the border, they could only target the Indian planes that had fired earlier. At 12:50, after the Indian forces finished launching the first wave of air-to-ground missiles, they began preparing for a second wave of attacks. But suddenly, an air-to-air missile came flying out of the darkness ahead. While the Indian pilots were still in shock, a Mirage 2000 instantly turned into a fireball, without even having time to sound the alarm. In fact, this Mirage was shot down before it could even start its return journey. After that, the missiles flying through the night went on to hit a Su-30 MKI and two Rafale fighter jets one after another. The final question is, did the Pakistani side use an early warning aircraft to guide the missile attacks? The Pakistani military quickly and happily revealed the truth of what happened that night. Pakistani fighter jets didn't shoot down the Indian aircraft at close range of a few dozen kilometers, but instead launched the attack from 180 kilometers away. In other words, just like the Indian Air Force, the Pakistani fighter jets stayed within their own territory the whole time, so they weren't detected by the Indian side. A popular theory in China is that the J-10C's air-to-air missiles carried out this ultra-long-range strike with guidance from an early warning aircraft, which is generally referred to as A-shoots, BGIBs. In fact, the J-10C was only responsible for launching the air-to-air missile. It didn't use its radar to lock onto the enemy aircraft. Instead, the early warning aircraft locked onto the target and guided the missile. Since the J-10C didn't turn on its radar, it was very difficult for the other side to detect its presence. However, Guan Yusha thinks this tactic is too advanced and technically demanding, and it's unlikely that Pakistan has mastered it. This is much more difficult than the J-10CE guiding and firing the missile by itself, and it's likely that Pakistan hasn't mastered it yet. The main reason is that most early warning aircraft don't have this capability. A major drawback of early warning aircraft radar is that it can't accurately determine the target's altitude. Generally, the role of an early warning aircraft is just to tell you roughly which direction the target is in, but it can't tell you the exact altitude of the target. To accurately lock onto a fast-moving target like a fighter jet, whose altitude is constantly changing, you still have to rely on the fighter's own onboard radar. Experts estimate, how did the J-10CE manage to pursue its opponent from more than 150 kilometers away? First, they used the Saab 2000 small early warning aircraft to spot aerial targets 300 to 400 kilometers away. Then, with the help of ground-based anti-radar support, they report the direction of the enemy aircraft. At this point, the J-10CE turns its nose towards the enemy aircraft and activates its onboard radar to lock onto the target. This aircraft is equipped with the most advanced potassium nitride active phased array radar among fighter jets of its class in the world today. It has 1,300 TR modules, with a total radar power output of 35.5 kilowatts, and its detection range against Rafale fighter jets can exceed 200 kilometers. On the other hand, the Rafale is equipped with a previous generation potassium zinc radar, which only has 838 TR modules and a total power output of just 3.7 kilowatts, meaning its power is only one-third of the J-10CE's radar. In other words, the J-10CE has already locked onto the Rafale, while the Rafale still has no idea it's being targeted. The J-10CE's active phased array radar can also operate in LPI, low probability of intercept, mode. You can think of this mode as a kind of flickering pattern. When searching for and locating targets, it can turn on and off intermittently, making enemy aircraft think these signals are just background noise. The official range of the export version of the PL-15 air-to-air missile is 145 kilometers, but if it's launched from high altitude in a lofted trajectory, it can hit targets within 180 kilometers. When the PL-15 gets within about 10 kilometers of the target enemy aircraft, it will reignite its engine and dive at high speed. At this point, the PL-15 will also activate its own onboard active phased array radar to lock onto the enemy aircraft for the final attack. By the time the Rafale realizes it's been locked on, the pilot only has a few seconds left to decide whether to eject and escape. In conclusion, firstly, the actual combat capability of the J-10CE is clearly a whole level above that of the Rafale. This is mainly thanks to the continuous and repeated upgrades of the J-10 series, such as improvements to its radar and so on. Unlike the Rafale series, which has basically stopped upgrading and is just coasting along, this situation is a bit like the current competition between domestic Chinese cars and joint venture brands. A real combat between India and Pakistan has clearly shown the strengths and weaknesses of Chinese versus Western weapons. Secondly, the Pakistan Air Force is at least a whole level ahead of the Indian military in terms of key weapon systems and overall operational systems, which is why they can deliver such overwhelming strikes. Thirdly, if China doesn't export potassium nitride to the US, they wouldn't even be able to produce the most advanced active phased array radars. That's why Trump often complains about China, but in the end, he never dares to completely break ties with China.